The Adventures of Mr. Incredible.
Hi, I'm Charles Preston, and I'm that guy from high school. And last night, I went to see The Incredibles 2. This movie has been coming for 14 years, and a lot of people consider The Incredibles to be one of their favorite movies and one of the best, or if not the best, Pixar movies of all time. And that leaves a lot of people with the question, is The Incredibles 2 bad? The short answer is no. Of course not. It's amazing. Now, as I've gone online and I've looked at a lot of other people's opinion, there seems to be a lot of confusion about the movie and a lot of varying opinions on its quality. And it usually boils down to about 4 points. And I feel like they're really kind of missing the whole intent of the movie and the purpose of what some of the choices were in the movie. So I'm going to go through a few of them and to kind of deconstruct what was going on in the movie. Point number 1, Bob is an asshole. A lot of people don't like Mr. Incredible in this movie. They feel like he's too mean or he's too much of an a-hole. And honestly, I don't really get that. I mean, yeah, he does have moments where he blows up at the kids, but that's understandable. He's a parent. And the parts where he's upset about Elastigirl getting chosen over him is not only understandable, but they establish why he acts the way he does in the movie. And it's not through overly aggressive symbolism or anything like that. They show it off in a very interesting way. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is when Bob sits down and he tries to relearn math for his son. I like this because it shows off exactly who he is. He calls himself Mr. Incredible, not because he has an ego, but because he wants to be the best that he can be. He wants to be great at everything he does. That's why he sits down and he learns the new math to try and help out his son. Because even though he's not being a superhero in the moment, he can still be incredible. And that's why when he is trying to become the stay-at-home parent and everything seems to be going awry, that's why it frustrates him. Because he's tired. He can't fight this with his physical strength. He has to try and overcome this in a different way. But this is also so frustrating for him because he's Mr. Incredible. He's supposed to be great. He's supposed to be super. This writing and this subtext is incredible because they don't just spell it all out for you. And I feel like that's why a lot of people just kind of let it slip by them. They didn't really stop and think about it. And that's okay because Uncle Charles is here to help. Now, a lot of people also had an issue with how he was acting in reaction to Elastigirl being chosen over him. And that also harkens back to him being Mr. Incredible. It's not that he doesn't want his wife to succeed. Of course he does. But he wants to be the one in the steering wheel because he wants to be at his best. He doesn't want her to do worse. He wants the opportunity to be who he is. He's just a guy who wants to do the most for other people because that is what he was meant to do. This is stated a few times in the movie, once by Decker, and then also it's shown in his actions. He has a very straightforward way of thinking, and that's the problem with Bob. That's his character flaw. He's just too straightforward, and this harkens back to his super strength. And that's why the dynamic between him and Elastigirl is so interesting. He has super strength, and so he grew up always treating his problems straightforward, lifting something or punching. Elastigirl has a less aggressive superpower, so she always solves things using her mind and problem solving. And while Bob does problem solve, he's not nearly to the level of Elastigirl in the creative uses of her powers. She's always turning herself into a chute or slinging around something, using her powers to slip through cracks or slingshot herself with a motorcycle. That was amazing, by the way. There's just so much characterization in these characters and the way that they use their powers. And God, I feel like I could go about it all day, but we've got other points to get to. Point number 2, the villain isn't as good as Syndrome. Now I'm going to try and keep this part as spoiler-free as possible. This problem has affected the Marvel Universe very recently. And by that, I don't mean that the villains aren't as good as Syndrome. I mean, they're not. But what I mean is, the problem is that people are mistaking quiet and subtle characters for bad ones or boring ones. The best example from the MCU is T'Challa the Black Panther. A lot of people have called him boring, or they called him not interesting, because he's not this Marvel quippy joke machine like all the rest of the heroes in the Marvel MCU. But that's just not true. The Black Panther is an interesting character. He's just a different kind. He's humble. He's not arrogant. He's honor bound, which is very different from the rest of the MCU. And a lot of that confusion over a bad character versus a different one has affected The Incredibles too. A lot of people have said that the Screenslaver isn't as fun a villain as Syndrome, that it's not as interesting, that the philosophy isn't as great. I feel a lot of that is very misleading. Some of it is true, but not in the way that you think. See, the Screenslaver is different from Syndrome, and the philosophy is very different, but that's because the Screenslaver is a direct antithesis to Syndrome. Syndrome was this loud, boisterous, funny villain who loved superheroes, and even though he was rejected by them, he still wanted to be them. He wanted to be like them. That's why he wanted to bring the supers back. The Screenslaver is the direct opposite of this. The Screenslaver is a creepy, ominous, in the shadows villain. The Screenslaver doesn't have a bunch of minions in a big island volcano lair. The Screenslaver is a lot more intimate and terrifying because you don't know who it is, and honestly it could be anyone as long as there's a screen nearby. And that's what makes the Screenslaver so threatening. The Screenslaver can turn pretty much anybody into an enemy, and at some point something like that does happen. And the Screenslaver wants to get rid of supers, while Syndrome wanted to bring them back. He just wanted to bring them back in his image. Some people have even been complaining about how the new villain doesn't have a set philosophy, or doesn't have a message that is just as profound as when everybody's super, nobody is. However, the Screenslaver does have their own message, and that message does come with a pretty thought-provoking philosophy, or a pretty thought-provoking conversation. The Screenslaver is one half of a conversation, and that conversation is it better to have superheroes that protect us and help us? Do they make our society delusional and make us too reliant on them in the long run? Now, I'm going to give a light spoiler for the Screenslaver, even though it's pretty obvious who it is from the early in the movie. I'm going to give a pretty light spoiler, so go ahead and skip to this point in the video, and if you don't want to have any spoils for it. The Screenslaver, she blames the culture around superheroes for the death of her parents. Her father wanted to wait for superheroes to save them from some intruders, where her mother wanted to run away and go hide. It was the father's reliance on superheroes which led to his death, and that's what led to the Screenslaver's opinion on superheroes and superhero culture. But another part of that conversation is her brother's point of view on superheroes, about how if superheroes hadn't been disbanded, their parents would still be alive because the superheroes would have saved their parents from the intruders. These are both very valid points, and either one could be considered the right answer. And it's not just so simple. Yes, superheroes do save us and they do protect us, but the culture around the superheroes do lead to people becoming too reliant on them, or to even people like Syndrome happening. In some regards, the Screenslaver is right. The culture around superheroes is what led to Syndrome, and Syndrome could have been one of the world's biggest threats had he not died in Incredibles 1, or might become the biggest threat to the world in Incredibles 3 if they decide to bring him back. But the point still stands that in some cases the Screenslaver is right, and on the other half of the conversation, superheroes do save lives, so it's not as black and white as some people may think. And the Screenslaver is a bit more interesting than Syndrome in the fact that the Screenslaver feels like a person. Like, Syndrome was definitely a comic book villain. He had an understandable motivation and we understood him, but he felt like a cartoon, like a comic book character. He spent his whole life trying to get revenge on a superhero, not because they did anything intentionally wrong to him, he just rejected him. And while we understand Syndrome's point of view, he still feels very much like a character from a movie. He has all these catchphrases and quippy one-liners, while the Screenslaver just feels like a normal person. People never think that they're the bad guys in their story. people always think that they're in the right somehow, regardless of what their point of view is. The screenslaver doesn't feel like what they're doing is wrong. They're doing it, they know that it's bad, but they think that the ends justify the means. They want to get superheroes outlawed because they think that that's what's best for the world. And that is interesting. They don't think that they're the bad guy in this. They're doing whatever it takes to try and protect the world. And kind of like how a parent would punish a child to keep them from doing wrong. That's how the screenslaver sees themselves. And that's pretty interesting and nuanced. I like villains like that. The ones that don't feel overly evil. Like they're not mustache twirling bad guys. They feel like they have goals, but it's not an evil goal. They're not rubbing their hands and cackling. They're just doing what they think is right. And if you don't find that interesting, then I weep for you. And the last thing I'm going to address is that a lot of people feel like it's not as good as the first movie. Now, this is purely subjective, but I feel like a lot of people are really letting nostalgia blind how good The Incredibles 2 is. Like, they're kind of letting their ideal that they built up for the first movie blind them to the strengths of this movie. They're not allowing themselves to really get into the story. They may like it, but they think it's just a cash grab, or they think that it's just a studio mandated sequel, when that's just not the case. If that were the case, then they would have released this years ago. This would have came out in the mid 2000s, or it would have came out in the early 2010s, not 14 years later. They held off on it because they wanted it to be as good as possible. And honestly, I felt like this was the Incredibles 2 that I wanted. It took everything from the first movie that was in subtext, right? Like everything that wasn't in the front of the first movies, like the supers being illegal and the consequences of superheroes and how they're going to bring it back. They took all that and they put it to the forefront. And this makes it feel much less like a sequel, but just a continuation of the story. Like it's one flowing narrative instead of two separate movies. And I think that is perfectly fine. And I think that it's not just, I don't think that it's just as good as the first one. I feel like it's a necessary continuation of the story. I never really felt like they needed to make Incredibles 2, but after seeing this, I feel like it really added more to the characters and to the world, and I'm glad that they made it. I feel like they could honestly just stop here and just leave the rest of it open-ended, but I mean, I was first about the wrong one, not needing a sequel, and so I'm looking forward to Incredibles 3 whenever that is to come out. Even if I'm like 30 by the time it comes out, I will be in the theaters and I will be watching it. Because it's just a solid film, and it does more than just be a solid film. I could sit here all day and talk about how the characters are great, how the humor is funny, how Edna Mode's cameos in it are freaking gold. But, I mean, you should just watch it for yourself and maybe look at it in a more positive light, and you'll see the things that this movie has done so right. I mean, of course, there are some problems. Every movie has those. Mainly that it took so freaking long to come out, but that's besides the point. This movie is just so great and feels like just a natural continuation to the first one, and I would hate for it to go down as a bad sequel or as a lackluster sequel, because it's just deserving of so much praise. Now, you notice I've never even talked about the animation in this movie, because the animation, of course, is better than the first one. Our technology is way better. Everything has so much detail and textures to it, and it's just gorgeous. But that's just how good it is. You can talk about all of the themes and all of the intricacies of it without having to resort to just, it looks nice. Honestly, there's so much to it. You should check it out for yourself. If you've seen it, please tell me what you thought about it in the comments. I do read the comments, and I respond to a lot of them. I really appreciate you guys watching my videos. I'm Charles Preston. That's my social media, and I'll see you guys next time.